Hello, and welcome to Archives and Records Simplified. These videos are aimed at people looking for basic knowledge about archives and records management, although at times I will also touch slightly on information and library science. These videos are designed to provide bite-sized chunks, which means that almost every video will be less than 15 minutes. These videos are honestly for everyone, and comments and suggestions are always more than welcome. About me, Sean McMillan, I'm an archivist based in London, and you can learn more about me via my LinkedIn profile, to which there is a link posted below. And I'll also post a transcript and notes also if you struggle at any point to understand my accent. And lastly, if you enjoy these videos, I would be extremely grateful if you could kindly like, subscribe and share. Thanks again. Okay, so imposter syndrome and some personal advice for how to overcome it. So, a quick definition of what imposter syndrome is, and maybe a quick explanation of why I'm doing a video on this specific topic. Imposter syndrome, as defined by Harvard Business School, is a situation where someone suffers from chronic self-doubt and a sense of intellectual fraudulence that overrides any feeling of success or external proof of their competence. Essentially, it might be defined as an unjust self-doubt. And the reason why I'm doing a video about this is that in response to requests for videos, in the last couple of days, people have asked me to mention a bit more about this, specifically in response to the video I did where I gave advice to people who've newly graduated. I think one of the things I said about that was to be more confident and to be more proactive, and quite a few people picked up on that and said that this is something they feel needs to be talked about more. And also, the more I think about it, it's actually something I've seen quite a lot in various different archives and library settings. I've come across a number of really highly qualified professionals who I've had a lot of respect for, who seem to feel strangely uncomfortable performing roles that they're very much qualified to do, or maybe even in some cases they've declined applying for certain jobs for fear that they would embarrass themselves in the interview, or that they weren't really qualified to do it. And I always feel that there's never really any harm in applying for a job. At the very least, it's a good learning curve. And just from a pure personal perspective, and I emphasise this is a personal opinion, it's something that I personally think often seems to affect people who work in the library and archive sector a little bit more. For example, I have friends that work in law, who work in construction, who work in business, and they don't seem to observe this as much as I do. So in this video, I'm going to give you some personal advice for how you might overcome that. And I emphasise personal because I'm not a trained psychologist, and if this is something that really affects you in a very serious way, then you would probably be better placed to speak to someone a bit more professional, or your line manager. This is me simply giving experiences that I've picked up in the last few years in the hope that you might get something from it. Okay, so a few general pieces of advice. The first thing I would say is that it's absolutely okay to learn from mistakes. I often sometimes think that the fear of making a mistake can often stop us from experimenting and trying new things. But obviously within reason. If you do something really bad, then that's probably best avoided, and that's maybe why we have risk analysis modules. But essentially, generally speaking, it is okay to make a slight mistake and to learn from it, and you'll find in the long term you're a better professional for it. The other thing I would say is it's honestly okay to ask questions. I've personally ran a few seminars and training events in the last couple of years, and I've often emphasised that there are often no stupid questions. There's a fantastic quote that I like, that when you ask a question, I can't remember the exact wording of this quote, but it goes somewhere along the lines that it's better to endure 5 seconds of discomfort than a lifetime of not knowing, which I think is really good. The other thing I would say is that people often tend not to judge you as much as you think they do. Sometimes we feel kind of vulnerable, or that people are thinking more about us than they actually are. To be honest, in my experience, most people tend to be more so wrapped up in their own lives and personal experiences that they tend not to give too much thought about others. The other thing I would say, and I think this is something worth noting, is that where possible, I would try separate feelings from facts. As part of my undergraduate degree, I studied psychology for 2 years, and I think there is something to be said for cognitive behavioural therapy, and sort of maybe being able to assess whether anxieties or certain phobias are really based on factual information. For example, if you have a formal qualification in a certain in a certain sector, is it really the case that you should self-doubt yourself? If you obtained a highly competitive position in a graduate trainee scheme, or even within a sort of basic library setting, those jobs as well are highly competitive. I undertook an interview. I was a part of an interview panel a couple of years ago for an archive assistant role, and we had over 100 candidates. So you often tend to find that these roles are highly competitive, and if you've made it through the application process, you're probably doing a lot better than you realise. The other thing I would say is please try not compare yourself with others today, and instead focus on comparing yourself to who you were yesterday. This is a common thing because I often feel that sometimes we tend to compare ourselves to people who maybe happen to start in the same position as us, who maybe did the same masters as us, or possibly the same age. And to be honest with you, I never really recommend this, because you'll find that you have different advantages and disadvantages to compare to others, and that really the only reasonable comparison is comparing yourself to who you were yesterday. What I would say is, if you are watching this video and you fall into this category, maybe think, where were you last year? Where were you 10 years ago? Are you doing better, or are you doing worse? And I think that the vast majority of people, I would suggest, are maybe doing a little bit better, especially if you're recently graduated or you're just about to undertake a master's course. The other thing I would say is it's absolutely, although this video is about overcoming imposter syndrome, I do think it's absolutely good to be self-reflective and to analyse areas of weakness, and then try set out to think about ways you can become better in those areas. But I would say that the best way to do this is to have a plan and set reasonable goals. Often when you're in the process of doing something or achieving something, you can perhaps lose track of how far you've come. And I think by setting goals and monitoring progress, you can actually realise how much you've done. And the last thing I would say, and obviously I mentioned this a little bit in my last slide, is that you're honestly not alone. I sincerely think this is something that quite a lot of people feel, and if this is something that you think affects you, I can promise you that you're probably not the only person who has unjustly doubted themselves at some point in their career. Okay, so the first thing I would say is that education absolutely is not the be-all and end-all. Actually, on a personal note, I often feel that we tend to underestimate the value of experience. And actually, I do think there should be a route into the archival profession for people who never went to university. But that said, it is my suspicion that the vast majority of people that watch these videos, certainly in terms of the people that I'm targeting these videos at, are either recently qualified or possibly contemplating undertaking one of the master's degrees, or maybe working a role in a university and are thinking of doing a graduate trainee scheme at some point. And there's a high chance that you're probably marked at level 6 at least on the educational spectrum, which puts you in a very, very, very high class. In order to get onto one of the master's degrees, you often need a minimum 2-1 undergraduate degree. So, on that basis, you're probably doing a lot better than you realise. And in terms of the educational spectrum, you're probably a lot more qualified than you maybe thought you were. And as I say, personally, I really do think there should be an opportunity for people with other experiences to build up a portfolio and to go in from other ways. And please don't be put off by this if you see this aspect of the video that I've made today. But generally speaking, I think that there is something to be said for remembering that you've done a lot better than you might have realised before. And you're a lot more qualified than I think you maybe thought you were. And I'd also say that there's something in recognising the value of other skills and experiences. I've often said that one of the biggest myths about our profession is that you need to be a history graduate or you need to come from a certain background in order to work as an archivist. There is a sort of perception that our profession is very sort of maybe sort of middle class and people from a certain background, and that probably has something to do with the fact that we have such high educational standards. But to be honest with you, I would say that many of the skills and experiences required for being an archivist or a librarian are highly relatable and highly valued skills that you can get in many other settings. For example, my first job, I worked at McDonald's in customer care, and my experience working with customers helped me obtain roles where I'd later be working with patrons and users. I know an archivist had previously worked as a cashier and was able to use this to demonstrate accuracy and attention to detail, which are often essential characteristics. I also know other professionals with backgrounds in IT, science, teaching and film studies who have used this experience to demonstrate how they've been able to do certain things that were relevant to being an archivist. So as I say, there's more than one route into the archival profession or the library profession, and don't feel like an imposter just because you have a different background. Okay, and I also feel slightly obliged to tell you a personal story about obtaining a job that I was actually not fully qualified to do. So this was one of my earlier jobs where there were 3 essential criteria, and I only met one of those 3 essential criteria. Now, I need to be absolutely honest, I did not lie in my application. I just decided to apply anyway and see what happens. And I think, as I say, like most times this probably won't work, and there was probably a certain element of luck here. But you know what? If you're not qualified for this role or you don't meet the full criteria, someone else might not either, and they'll apply for it. And often, it's not often the perfect candidate that gets the job, it's often the best candidate that gets the job, and there is a distinction with that. And I would certainly say that it's sometimes worth more of a chance than you realise. Okay, and also I would say please remember that less qualified people than you have taken on far more important jobs. The picture you see here is of Frank Abagnale, who was portrayed in a film by Leonardo DiCaprio called Catch Me If You Can. This film was about a very successful con man who I think started out as a teenager, who successfully posed as a lawyer, as a doctor, and I think as a pilot. Now, let me be absolutely clear here. I'm not recommending that you break the law in any way, and I hope I'm not glorifying fraud here, because that's not something I would generally do here. But I do think there's some value in self-confidence and being able to portray self-confidence. And I'm sure there's perhaps a certain precedent that maybe people often feel is less qualified to do a far more important job. So I re-emphasize it again. Please remember that less qualified people than you have often taken on far more important jobs. Okay, and finally, I'm going to finish with some further reading and references. What I would say is, from doing a quick search, I did notice quite a couple of blog posts about this, specifically from archivists, which kind of leads me to believe that that kind of confirms my idea that this is something that seems to be more prevalent in our sector than others. Lastly, I have to say I really enjoyed making this video. This one sort of caught me out a bit. It's a bit from the left field, and I think that it's quite a good one in the sense that it's not really something, as far as I can see, that is covered in the literature as much, or that you would read about elsewhere. So if there's anyone else that has any experiences of this and wants to contact me either publicly or anonymously, please do, and I'd maybe be happy to do a follow-up video, maybe a case study of someone who felt like an imposter and went on to overcome it. Otherwise, I hope you enjoyed the video, and please let me know if you have any suggestions. Thanks again. And if you enjoy these videos, I would be extremely grateful if you could like, subscribe, and share. And also just to remind you that I would be absolutely delighted to take any requests for future videos also.